You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 251 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. As always, talking about the wars on today's show, specifically going to be talking about Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the CIA. So foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or just go to the Libertarian Institute. The web address there is libertarianinstitute.org. And on that site, you can find my daily news roundup and my podcast on the homepage. And, I publish some articles occasionally, and they're usually at the Libertarian Institute as well. All right. So as I mentioned, I'm starting off talking about the CIA. Gina Haspel, who's the new CIA director and previously, in her job was a torturer and then involved in the cover up of that torture. So very corrupt woman, has a lot of obvious moral issues and deficiencies. There was quite a bit of press that surrounded her nomination. You had like kind of the more mainstream establishment movement that focused it around her being the first woman director of the CIA. But then there was a lot of attention in all the alternative media. Specifically, you had former CIA agent Ray McGovern, who was actually dragged out of her, I believe, committee hearing, trying to get the senators there to ask her about her role in torture. And, the Capitol Police actually threw him to the ground and I believe injured his shoulder. But, like always, the corrupt, evil torturers go on to get promotions. And this is true in the case of Gina Haspel, just like the rest of them. But now the CIA under her has kind of put out their SITS goals. I guess, and this is public too. So, this being the CIA, always got to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, and also got to realize that there's probably a bunch of covert things that they're trying to do. But this could give us an actual good summary and insight, at least as much as, the general public is going to get about the CIA in the coming years. Her first goal is diversity and inclusion. This seems to be more of, just along the lines of the general trend of, we need to look to be more fair and equitable when employing people. And of course, Gina Haspel herself, as I mentioned before, got some mention as, being the first female head of the CIA. Now, my only problem with this isn't that it would lead to more minorities or women being hired on at the CIA. It's that it means the CIA is just going to keep hiring people. I don't think the organization should really exist to begin with at all, but specifically not the, kind of covert active aspect of the CIA that does so much more than just kind of collect information and intelligence and look to, uncover 9/11 plots to save American lives. When in reality, what it's doing is arming and backing the jihadists, the Al-Qaeda types, like what happened in Syria under CIA Director John Brennan in Operation Timber Sycamore, where we actually took the side of the jihadists and gave them arming and fun weapons, and maybe not directly, but we certainly knew where those weapons and where that money was going, and many of the fighters that were trained eventually, just outright joined the jihadist group. So, terrible things that the CIA does really shouldn't exist. The next one was summarized in a tweet as invest more heavily in collections against hardest issues. If you read the whole tweet, it makes it sound like the hardest issues would be the nation state actors. And so I'm not quite sure she's talking about or probably all of it, whether it's North Korea versus Al-Qaeda, or if it's Al-Qaeda versus North Korea versus the Syrian state and Assad versus, Iran, Russia, China. And so very well could be, now that the CIA is going to be looking to take more, kind of covert action against all these countries, or it could just mean, I think probably the, a little bit lesser, states than the great powers of Russia and China, North Korea and Iran, that the CIA would look to, collect more information on. It's certainly not a good thing, at least as far as we could tell, that the CIA would be collecting more information on these countries. I don't think we see any indication that would make us safer. In fact, it would probably lead to, the possibility of CIA operations being drawn up against these governments. So you could think like the coup against, the Iranian government in 56, or just smaller meddling like supporting, rebel factions within these countries like the United States has done in Syria, Chechnya, Georgia, etc. Third goal, increase the number of officers stationed overseas. Again, in line with the other, the point two that I just mentioned, that the issue here is that the CIA doing more likely means the CIA doing more regime change type operations. The CIA is an aggressive agency. And so the bigger and the more of the CIA, especially under somebody like Gina Haspel, who has proven herself to be, that aggressive member of the CIA, not a Ray McGovern type, an analyst who sat there and went through, all the information to kind of paint the picture to, the president and the leadership of the country, what's going on overseas covertly. This is more a type of situation with the more the CIA does, the more propaganda that's created, because even, if they're producing all this intelligence, what it creates an ability to do is to like cherry pick through that intelligence and to prevent false or misleading information. See 2003 in Iraq. Number 4 is invest in foreign language. And so this is one of those things that, if you actually want to have a CIA, that should probably be done. And it's been something that's been pointed out with the CIA by some, pretty good analysts. And I think I've even seen Ray McGovern say this, is that, a lot of the foreign language speakers in the CIA speak the languages of our allies, not our enemies, making them far less useful. And so while in one sense, you would like to have a more efficient agency that does better things, this is an evil agency, and the better they are, I think the more evil they'll do, rather than, this is just an agency that like makes mistakes, and better, translators would equate to better information being passed up the chain of command and smarter decisions being made overall. Number 5, build stronger relations with other U.S. agencies and foreign intelligence agencies. One of the things that happened after 9/11 is they said that had our, NSA, CIA, FBI all been communicating with each other better, that event wouldn't have happened. So on that scale, the sharing of information may seem like a good thing. However, we also have to remember tied in with that is you see sharing of information like what goes on between the FBI and the NSA. And I believe the CIA or the IRS, gets in on this too, where the NSA passes information collected through its bulk or mass spying data collection capabilities. And then while that evidence is obtained without a warrant, so therefore illegally, they pass that information over to the FBI. And while the FBI may never actually present that evidence in court, what they call it is like a parallel construction, and basically use that information to help them either fabricate or find evidence that somebody has committed a crime. And, this really does lead to a situation where that mass spying, that those mass data collections that, were first denied and then said, well, we have safeguards to make sure it's not being used against the American people, is now being used against the American people. And so further tying the CIA in with that, I don't really think is going to be good for any of us. They may claim that it's going to help them to stop terrorism, but at the end of the day, when you're looking at what the CIA is actually doing, they seem more often than not to be helping the terrorists, not actually doing anything to prevent terrorism. Last point, number 6 here, is counter narcotics abroad. And so you think, my guess here is that this means more CIA intervention in Central and South America, and then I'm guessing Afghanistan is another big target here. And so I think we could look at this as a couple things. Maybe Gina Haspel is trying to impress Donald Trump by, getting in on this counter narcotics thing, especially in Mexico, in Afghanistan, where it ties in with other U.S. goals, the war in Afghanistan and, kind of the border problem, the gains down there, the war on drugs, all that kind of stuff. Again, there's very problematic things about these programs. If we look at the drug war the U.S. has fought in Afghanistan, it's been highly ineffective. As me and Will Porter discussed in an article we published at Consortium News last year, the amount of opium produced in Afghanistan is at all-time highs. There's more land being used than ever to grow opium in Afghanistan. So even though they've destroyed a record amount of opium fields, they also see a record amount of opium produced at the end. And while these are mostly Pentagon programs, in an article by Andrew Coburn in Harper's Magazine that really exposes how all these Pentagon programs helped actually increase the opium trade in Afghanistan. Simply put, the U.S. intervention has this pattern of creating what we're trying to stop. And so I think it would be likely to see that the CIA did try to intervene in Afghanistan by, trying to tamp down the opium trade there. We would probably only end up with more poppies being grown. And then I've seen, several issues with, especially DEA programs right now. In fact, there's one being investigated by the Department of Justice, because it likely led to several massacres in Mexico. But you also have other ones. I believe this story comes from Honduras, but was a Central American country. And I'll correct myself if I'm wrong later on. But you had a DEA boat traveling down the river at night. It collides with a civilian watercraft, and either the U.S. DEA agents on the boat or the police that we were arming, training, funding, supporting, opened fire on a couple of pregnant women. I believe it killed at least one of them. A horrific story. And of course, you could look at Iran-Contra or other issues where the U.S. and our covert agencies have meddled within Central and South America, either on behalf of the drug dealers or in policies that only ended up, at the end of the day, supporting and increasing, the prosperity of different drug cartels. So I read a couple of pretty good articles, I believe both from the New York Times on Afghanistan. The first one detailed how Afghanistan is no longer releasing kind of the body count, the number of dead Afghan, either soldiers or police, but Afghan forces that are killed. But that number is believed to be around 57 a day, which really, was shockingly high to me, and, is possibly causing now a real problem for the Afghan army. It's long been known and reported that while the Afghan army claims to have high numbers, a lot of those soldiers are ghost soldiers, people who either go and register for the military, collect their first paycheck, take their guns and their boots and go home, or, really never exist in the first place and are just there for like the commanding officers or whatever to collect their paychecks for them. Either way, the strength of the Afghan army is not what it looks like on paper, and if they're taking these massive casualties, it could be a real problem. That article also details how there's pretty low recruiting numbers, especially in the heavy Taliban areas. They said that in the Helmand province, they're only seeing like 2 or 3 recruits a week. And this was reflected in other provinces that are heavily dominated by the Taliban. I don't know if, the Taliban are ever going to win a war of attrition against the United States and the Afghan government outright. Like, eventually, there's just no Afghan men willing to go and fight for the Kabul government. And I believe on episode 100 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast, I asked Scott Horn that question, and he said that he didn't kind of see that either. However, maybe all these deaths will start to rack up, and it will be cause for the Afghan people to just say no more to the Afghan government, and, to really start to push them to look for a peaceful solution to this problem. Another article I read just laid out how the Pentagon is trying to present Trump with the body count of the number of Taliban that are killed in Afghanistan as a way to try to influence Trump to stay in the war. I'm sure that, I think it's probably more of a correlation than causation that, when there's a lot of enemy troops dying, the war is going well. And that it's not necessarily that because a lot of enemy troops are dying that the war is going well, and we've seen the Taliban continue to be able to produce large number of soldiers to go out and fight for their cause. And so I don't see how a high number of casualties on the Taliban side is ever going to be something that really turns the tides of the war. In fact, if you look, they're bragging about these high body counts, but the Taliban continue to wage more attacks and take more and more territory. It's also probably and I think this was laid out in the first New York Times article that I was talking about. It's less important for an insurgent group like the Taliban to be able to rally a lot of recruits. And this is because the Afghan government has to defend everywhere to, kind of be the legitimate government of the territory. But all the Taliban has to do is pick one city, one district, one police headquarters to attack at a time. And then, they're just forced to hold a lot less territory. You've seen situation, I believe it was Kunduz in 2015, and then Farah and Ghazni in 2018, where the Taliban actually take the city and hold it for a few days and then leave. And so they don't take the massive casualties that the Afghans do, having to hold all this territory. Syria. I got some updates from, the big story last week, which was, of course, the shoot down of the Russian surveillance plane by the Syrian state. Russian reports have come out on the issue, and they're really blaming Israel, saying that Israel intentionally notified Russia very late that the attack was coming. I think the Russian statement is that 1 minute before, the Israeli said the attack was going to hit another site, not the site it hit, and that the Israeli F-15s intentionally used this Russian surveillance plane as kind of a radar shield against the Syrian air defense systems. Prior to this, the Syrians had the S-200 missile system, which is a Russian system, I think developed several decades ago. And one of the shortcomings with this S-200 missile system is that it doesn't have great intelligence for selecting a target. And so when you had on the radar an Israeli F-15 and the Russian spy plane, I guess within relatively the same area, the missile hit the wrong plane because the Russian surveillance plane was a much bigger target. The S-300 systems that Russia now says that they're going to deploy to Syria within, I guess I shouldn't say deploy, deliver, because I think they're actually giving or selling them to Assad. The S-300 missile system will be included with an IFF system. And basically what this does is when it lots onto a target, it sends some kind of notification, and then the plane that's being targeted has the ability to, I guess, type in some code, and that code will cause the missile to disengage. And so this would have prevented what happened. Now, the S-300 system has been something that Russia has long floated bringing to Syria, and I think had plans to, but didn't end up doing it at the strong request of the Israeli government. And so I think on top of the fact that the Israeli government used this Russian surveillance plane as a radar shield, you also have the issue that the reason the Syrian missile that was fired didn't have the ability to hit the Israeli plane and not the Russian plane, or at least not hit the Russian plane, was that, the strong objection of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to Vladimir Putin. So I'm sure Russia feels a little additionally slighted on the issue for that reason. I think this S-300 missile system may change the game a little bit in Syria, especially when it comes to Israeli airstrikes in that country. At least from the data I've been able to collect, I think this would expand Syria's ability to kind of monitor the skies, including above Lebanon, which is where the Israeli planes have been launching their attacks from. And it would also allow the Syrian missile defense or air defense to better be able to target the Israeli planes. So this could really limit or even possibly, I guess, prevent Israeli strikes in Syria. We know there's been over 200 of these strikes, often what Israel says are Hezbollah or Iranian targets. And I'm sure in those 200 strikes, they've leveled some actual toll against the Hezbollah and Iranian capabilities in Syria, which is, of course, fighting wars right now primarily against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so if you're looking at, just the direct practical effects of these Israeli airstrikes in Syria, they don't really help Israel. They're just helping Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, National Security Advisor and lifelong hawk John Bolton called the delivery of the S-300 missile system to Syria a significant escalation. Now, those kind of words typically mean that there's some big offensive or something like that, but this is really mostly a defensive weapon. I mean, I'm sure it can be used for offensive capabilities. And so hopefully, the big impact of this missile system being introduced into Syria, I think, is that Israel carries out less airstrikes in Syria, and it just further reduces the complications of this way too complicated civil war. In another terrible statement by NSA John Bolton, he said that the United States troops will remain in Syria as long as Iranians are operating outside of Iran. Now, first of all, this statement is absurd. Even if Assad now, I guess, kits all the Iranians out of Syria and they go over to Iran, then the U.S. troops still won't leave Syria. So now, I mean, if you're looking at it from the position of Bashar al-Assad, there's really no reason to push the Iranians to leave other than, your own internal reasons. But the pressure from the U.S. doesn't matter because the U.S. is just going to claim that there's Iranians in Yemen and Iraq and possibly Afghanistan and other countries. and the U.S. troops will stay in Syria for that reason. So I think this is like kind of almost overplaying the hand to the point of being so hostile that you put your enemies in the position that they can't cave because they can't meet your demands, either because they're just that impractical or like just impossible because the conditions they're describing don't exist. So from the perspective of Assad and Syria, it's an absolutely unachievable demand, and one that I think it's kind of obvious the Assad government won't even look to meet. I think you have a similar problem from the perspective of Iran, that the United States, for example, has, I believe, troops in about 150 countries worldwide. And most countries do seem to deploy their troops to an allied nation, at the very least for training exercises. And so, maybe Bolton or Pompeo or Trump would later go on to clarify that, they could have a token amount of troops in Russia, or, how would this apply to, let's say, I don't know if Iran does have an embassy in a country like Somalia, but having an embassy in a country that's dangerous, that, most countries, other countries deploy troops along with their consulate there to protect the diplomatic personnel there. This may not be true if they're coming to the U.S., but again, there's different situations in African countries, the Middle East, etc. And so likewise with Syria, the demand just seems absolutely unachievable. Also, Iran, helped to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And at the end of the day, there's worse things than Iranian troops being deployed in Iraq and Syria. I hope one day, they go home. But at the same time, if they're there fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that's not something that anybody in the U.S. should really care all too much about. Reuters reported that one of the jihadist groups in the Syrian Idlib province rejected the deal proposed by Turkey and Russia. And this is basically a ceasefire between the Syrian government and the Syrian rebels. But the Syrian rebels are made up of tons of different factions, ranging from those being somewhat controlled by Turkey to these jihadist factions being pretty much completely on their own. This particular faction isn't a super powerful one. It's not Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, HTS. But this is a rebel group that does have, I believe, a couple hundred foreign fighters. It does control some territory, and they say they're not going to abide by the ceasefire agreement. The Syrian government has said that they are, and the Turkish obviously are, and so the rebels that they support are, as this is, kind of a Turkey proposed. This is really driven by Turkey, the ceasefire in Idlib. The main jihadist coalition, the main coalition of Syrian rebels that really don't fall under the umbrella or the power of the Turkish government, HTS, has not yet declared if they will follow this ceasefire agreement or not. This could be some indication that they won't. But hopefully we get this news in the coming days. And, as much as it's hard to say what would be the best situation in Idlib, anything that prevents fighting, does seem to be a good thing, especially with, the extremely hawkish positions the United States is taking, should Assad and Russia begin that offensive in Idlib. Alright, that's all, most of what I have about the foreign wars. There were a couple stories about weapon sales that I did want to mention on today's show. The first is that Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, went to Congress and certified that Saudi Arabia and their coalition that the United States is a big part of, but apparently they say that the Saudis do the targeting, was avoiding civilian casualties in Yemen. Now, in the month of August, there were 2 strikes that killed, one killed about 40, and I believe the other one killed about 20 children. Absolutely horrific strikes, one on a school bus, and then one at a bus station. There was a bombing of fishermen that killed 18. And the bombings there are really daily. You also have the new offensive going on, I think, since about September 9th, for the Port of Hodeidah. And that's starting to cut off the aid to the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. And the UN is warning that the famine in Yemen is absolutely imminent. But despite all this, despite all the evidence that what Saudi Arabia is doing is waging a war against the civilian population of Yemen, along with their coalition partners, the UAE and the US, and the UK also plays a big role in it that I never talk about. are waging this war that's, nearly deliberately targeted at civilians and resulting in the starvation, death of babies, infants, and children. And so when Mike Pompeo announced this and then later discussed the decision-making process, he specifically pointed to a department of the State Department, and that is the Legislative Affairs Desk. And this department is headed by a former Rayethon lobbyist. So, of course, Rayethon is a weapon maker company that has profited heavily off of the war in Yemen, selling their weapons to Saudi Arabia. Some of those weapons that Raytheon has sold, kind of through State Department has to approve these weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, have shown up at the desks of children, fragments from their bombs, showing that Saudi Arabia is using weapons made by Raytheon, where, all these executives profit, to blow up little Yemeni children. And actually, I finally gotta give some credit to the mainstream media here and say that CNN did a pretty good job, reporting and exposing this. Now, it's something that we've all known for years and years and years. But, I finally got a CNN story that I could link to where they show these bomb fragments of U.S. made bombs at all these sites of massacres in Yemen. And, maybe, some more of my mainstream friends will start to pay attention and share that kind of stuff. The last thing I want to mention here is the State Department approved a $330 million weapons sale to Taiwan. The U.S. has this complicated relationship with China, with Taiwan, and it's an interesting kind of thing. I even saw there's a lot of nations now that are changing their airport signs to show Taiwan as a part of China rather than being like its kind of own country, which it has more or less operated as for quite some time now. China believes that Taiwan is a part of China, and I don't know if they consider the state there to be an active rebellion against the Chinese state, but they certainly believe that mainland China rules Taiwan. The United States has provided the Taiwanese government, and therefore, I'm assuming from the Chinese, the perspective of the separatists, the rebels, with tons of weapons, including, anti-missile defense systems and F-35s. In fact, I believe this weapon sale is mostly parts for the F-35. So in looking at the, kind of the grand scheme of things, when the United States is trying to use our relationship with China to leverage it against Russia, to leverage it against Iran, maybe to help out a little bit in Afghanistan, where China shares a border, the United States, is really jeopardizing that relationship and, sacrificing a lot of things, plays an important role with North Korea as well. We can't forget that. In order to sell a couple $100 million worth of weapons, that's only going to profit the rich, weapons maker executives in the United States. And, we see, this is a perfect example of the corruption of the bureaucracies of the U.S. government, where we now have a Raytheon lobbyist running this desk that has influence over Mike Pompeo's decisions on these issues. It's horrific. It really is. And, it's people making money off of dead children. And it's just the worst thing in the world. And so, let's stop these weapon sales. The Senate could stop all these weapon sales. All they have to do is vote and say no to it. But they never do. They usually don't even bother having a vote. They just greenlight it. Whatever the State Department says, we'll sell weapons to everyone. No requirement of the State Department to come to Congress and explain to them, how this fits in with the United States foreign policy and why we need to sell Taiwan all these weapons and, who's making the money, because I think that's an important issue too. And then maybe discuss how all the people in the room are, receiving large campaign contributions from these weapons makers. But that's not likely to happen anytime soon, so I'm keep on doing this show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, Facebook, Libertarian Union, Twitter at KYAAALE. And if you really like the show, you really want to support it, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I really appreciate it, everyone. And I'll be back with another show Friday.